At this moment there arrived one of their comrades with a jolly flushed face. Being late, he had probably been walking quicker than usual, and he had not reckoned on running into me. But as soon as he caught sight of me, the expression of his face changed, and, coming up to me, he burst out at once with his sentence, learned by heart from the list of sympathies. At this point I could no longer contain myself, and, turning to them all, said, "Have you heard the peculiar intonation, not proper to him, with which your comrade who has just come has delivered his bombastic speech? Did you? Good. Now then, ask him, that is, beg him, please, for once in his life to make an exception and to say honestly whether his inside, that is his real being, had any connection whatever with his spoken words." Of course it had none, and how could it be otherwise, for, in the first place, the deceased person concerned in this case was not a blood brother of his, and, in the second place, he could not possibly know or feel what attitude the person to whom he addressed his flowery speech had toward the event. His words were spoken quite mechanically, without the least participation of his being, and he said them only because, in his childhood, his nurse had taught him in such cases to lift the right leg and not the left. But why be insincere even in those cases when there is absolutely no advantage in it for your being, not even for the satisfaction of your egoism? Is it not enough that our daily life is filled to overflowing with insincerity, thanks to the abnormally established habits of our mutual relationships? Unfailingly to express sympathy at the death of anyone or anybody is just such a vicious habit, instilled in childhood, thanks to the totality of which our half-intentional actions come to an automatic end. To express one's sympathy to someone in the case of the death of a person close to him was considered in ancient times an immoral, even criminal action. Perhaps it was considered so because it is easily possible that, in the being of that person who is being thus addressed, the process of the fresh impression of the loss of a close person has not yet quieted down, and by these empty words of sympathy he is reminded of it again, and his suffering aroused anew. From such a habit, customary at the present time in the case of anyone's death, no one derives any benefit, and the person thus addressed only great harm. Such habits, established in contemporary life, offend me especially, perhaps because I have had the opportunity of becoming acquainted with the customs used in the same cases in the lives of people who lived many centuries before us. Many thousand years ago, when a person died, for the first 3 days no one would be present at the place of this sad happening except the priests and their assistants. Only on the 4th day there would assemble all the relations and relations by marriage, as well as neighbors, acquaintances, and even strangers who wished to come. In the presence of all those assembled, the priests first conducted the religious ceremonies at the door of the house, and then, in the company of all, carried the dead to the graveyard, where they again carried out a special ritual, and then buried him. After that, if the deceased was a man, all the men returned to the deceased's house. If a woman, then all the women. All the others separated and returned home. Those people who had returned to the house of the deceased first of all ate and drank, but only that food, the ingredients of which the deceased himself had prepared during his lifetime for this purpose. After this meal, they gathered in the largest room of the house, and set themselves down to the so-called remembering feast, recalling to mind and relating only the bad and evil deeds of the deceased during his life, and this they did daily for 3 days. After this peculiar 3-day procedure, or as one might now call it, not leaving a good hair on his head, or as they called it then, washing the bone of the dead down to the white of the ivory, all those who had taken part gathered daily in the house of the deceased for 7 days, but this time in the evenings after their daily duties were finished. During these 7 days it was no longer the custom to offer food, but many different sorts of incense were burned constantly in the same room in which the assembly took place, at the cost of the deceased or of his heirs. All present sat or kneeled quietly, and, in the well-known atmosphere called forth by the incense, they first chose from among themselves the worthiest by age and reputation as leader. And then they began to give themselves up to the contemplation of the inevitability of their own death. At certain intervals the leader would say to all present the following: "Do not forget how he has lived, whose breath has not yet vanished from this place, how he behaved unworthily for a man, and did not accept the fact that he, as well as all others, must die." After such an utterance by the leader, all those present had to sing together the following: "O ye holy, higher forces, and immortal spirits of our ancestors, help us to keep death always before our eyes, and not to succumb to temptation." I will not add more, but will leave it to each one of you to decide for himself what advantage there might be if such a savage custom could be established again. I hope that you now partially understand why just these expressions of sympathy of yours affect my inner being almost in the same way as your American products of nourishment affect the English system. It would be desirable for all, for God, for the deceased, for you, for me, and even for the whole of humanity, if, at the death of any person, instead of the process of the expression of senseless words, the process of the real grasping of your own forthcoming death would take place in you. Only the complete realization by man of the inevitability of his own death can destroy those factors, implanted thanks to our abnormal life, of the expression of different aspects of our egoism, this cause of all evil in our common life. Only such a realization can bring to birth again in man those formerly present divine proofs of genuine impulses: faith, love, and hope. As I spoke the above, there occurred to me, I don't know why, the verse of a very old Persian song, and quite involuntarily I recited it on the spot. As it had slipped out so involuntarily, I was forced, in order to hide the force of my automatic thought at this moment from the consciousness of those present, willy-nilly, to take the trouble of explaining the contents of these verses of the Persian song in English. With the words of these ancient Persian verses, a scientific wisdom is expressed, which one may express in your customary language approximately as follows: If all men had a soul, long ago there would have been no room left on earth for poisonous plants or wild beasts, and even evil would have ceased to exist. Soul is for the lazy fantasy, luxury for the indulger in suffering. It is the determiner of personality, the way and the link to the Maker and Creator. soul is the residue of education, the prime source of patience. It is also testimony of the merit of the essence of eternal being. Leader of the will, its presence is I am. It is a part of the all-being. It was so and always will be. In short, irrespective of my unquestionable wish to work, and irrespective of the fact that at any convenient or inconvenient opportunity I wrote and wrote, so that I might finish this book and attain the end of all the tasks I had set myself, I was nevertheless unable to do so.